On October 30th, 2025, Buckingham Palace issued a statement. It was 3 paragraphs long. It said that Prince Andrew would henceforth be known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. It said that formal notice had been served requiring the surrender of the Royal Lodge lease. It said he would move to alternative private accommodation. Inside the house, the largest grace and favor residence in the Crown Estate, where a Queen Mother had died and a prince had spent millions making himself at home. A woman read the statement and found that she was not in it. Sarah Ferguson had lived at Royal Lodge for 17 years. She had called herself a guest. She had raised her daughters there, hosted their weddings from there, built an entire life inside walls that were never legally hers. The statement that ended the arrangement did not mention her name. She was simply someone who had been there and who would now have to be somewhere else. The House of York was the glamorous, troublesome junior branch of the House of Windsor. The war hero prince, the red-haired bride, the daughters with storybook titles. The public saw the fairy tale, then the scandal, then the punchline. What they did not see was the woman who refused to disappear, and the family system that spent 3 decades trying to decide what to do with her. This is that story. It spans 4 decades, 2 reigns, a marriage, a divorce, a fortress, and a reckoning. It is the story of how Sarah Ferguson made herself structurally impossible to erase, and what it cost her, her daughters, and the dynasty that could neither absorb her nor let her go. To understand how it came to that, how a palace statement could end a domestic arrangement that had survived divorce, disgrace, financial scandal, and the death of a queen, you have to go back, not merely to the marriage, or even to the scandal that supposedly destroyed it, but to the architecture of royal belonging itself. Because what happened at Royal Lodge was never simply a housing dispute between a king and his disgraced brother. It was the final act of a negotiation that had lasted more than 30 years between a woman who refused to vanish and an institution that could not decide whether she was family or furniture. And to understand how Sarah Ferguson made herself structurally impossible to erase from the House of Windsor, you have to begin with the house itself. Royal Lodge sits in 98 acres of Windsor Great Park, a 30-room residence shielded from public view by old trees and older conventions, a place so layered with Windsor memory that to live there was not merely to have a roof, but to make a claim on the dynasty's emotional center. The property had been used by the Duke and Duchess of York, the future George VI, and Queen Elizabeth in the 1930s, and after the king's death, it became the Queen Mother's Windsor residence for roughly 50 years. She died there on March 30th, 2002, at the age of 101. Her coffin was carried from the house she had occupied for half a century, and then what she left behind was not merely a building, it was a vessel of meaning. Every room carried the residue of a particular kind of royal domesticity. Maternal, conservative, built on the unspoken assumption that certain women held families together by occupying the right rooms in the right houses at the right time. The Queen Mother had understood this. She had been the matriarch of place, and when she died, the place she had made sacred became available for inheritance. Prince Andrew took a 75-year lease on Royal Lodge in 2003. The terms were extraordinary by any standard outside the Crown Estate's private arrangements with members of the royal family. A one-off payment of £1 million, a reported obligation to spend $7.5 million on refurbishment, and an annual peppercorn rent on a property valued at roughly £30 million. He moved in during 2003 and 2004, and the builders followed. The refurbishment was extensive. The house was modernized, extended, made grand, in the way that Andrew understood grandeur. Not austere, not self-denying, but scaled to the life he believed was his by right. From the outside, the arrangement looked like a straightforward piece of royal property succession. The Queen Mother's favorite grandson stepping into the Queen Mother's favorite house, a quiet transfer within the family. But the arrangement was never straightforward, because it depended on a set of assumptions that were already beginning to erode, that Andrew's royal status would remain intact, that his financial position would remain stable, that the institution would continue to treat the lease as a private family matter rather than a public question about privilege. None of those assumptions would survive the next 2 decades, but in 2003 they felt permanent. That is what made the trap. Within 5 years, the woman who would make the house most controversial had moved in. Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, Andrew's ex-wife, divorced since 1996, stripped of her Royal Highness style and publicly repositioned as one of the monarchy's most visible embarrassments, took up residence at Royal Lodge in 2008. She described herself, in the careful language she had learned to deploy around royal matters, as a guest. Just a guest, a very lucky guest. But she was not a guest. She was a permanent domestic presence in one of the crown's most symbolically charged houses, living with a man she had divorced 12 years earlier, raising daughters who were fifth and sixth in line to the throne, and occupying a space that the institution had never invited her to fill. From that point, what had looked temporary became structural. The divorced couple were no longer simply co-parenting from adjacent lives. They were sharing a grand royal house, and in doing so, they were making visible a fact the monarchy preferred to keep invisible: that the attempt to expel Sarah Ferguson from the family had failed. She had not been let back in. She had simply never fully left. And the house, the Queen Mother's house, the house that carried half a century of Windsor domestic mythology, had become the physical proof. Financially, the York position was always more precarious than the public image allowed. Their status was enormous. Their independent money was less so. Andrew's Royal Lodge deal looked aristocratic, but it depended entirely on a crown estate arrangement that existed at the pleasure of the institution. Sarah's post-divorce finances were publicly presented as humiliatingly small in comparison with Diana's settlement. A reported £500,000 per year and a £1.5 million trust for the daughters, set against Diana's £17 million. That disparity was not merely financial. It was a measure of institutional value, a calculation of what each woman was worth to the system and what the system would pay to be rid of her. From the very beginning, then, the York branch of the House of Windsor was sustained by proximity, housing, title, and maternal tolerance, not by a solid independent fortune, and that made exile both easier to threaten and harder to enforce, because the family could always withdraw the arrangements, but the person living inside them had nowhere else to go. That domestic arrangement cannot be understood without the code it was defying. The code belonged to Prince Philip. Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was not the protagonist of this story, but he was its superego, the embodiment of a set of values that the House of Windsor had elevated into something close to doctrine: stoicism, containment, service performed without complaint and without visible mess, a visceral, class-inflected disgust at emotional incontinence, at the spectacle of private failure made public, at anyone who brought the family's name into disrepute through weakness rather than design. Philip had married into the monarchy himself. He had surrendered his own name, his Greek and Danish titles, and his naval career to the demands of his wife's position, and had done so with a discipline that he expected, demanded, others match. He was not a man who forgave easily. He was a man for whom certain failures of conduct were not errors to be corrected, but stains that could not be removed. And by every account that filtered through palace briefings, staff memoirs, and decades of press reporting, Philip's judgment of Sarah Ferguson, once it hardened after the events of 1992, was total. He could not bear to be in the same room as her. Whether one takes those accounts as literal description or as an index of the wider family climate, the dramatic truth is the same. Sarah became the kind of woman that the Philip Windsor Code most despised, a woman who had made private chaos visible, who had let the body and its appetites be photographed, who had turned royal intimacy into tabloid sport, in an institution that could survive sorrow, betrayal, even cruelty. So long as it remained hidden, the unforgivable sin was exposure. And Sarah had been exposed. Queen Elizabeth II occupied the counterweight position. No, where Philip was severity, the Queen was shelter. Where Philip drew lines, the Queen left doors ajar. Her role in the York story was never dramatic. She did not confront, did not issue ultimatums, did not stage the kind of emotional reckoning that resolves a crisis. Her role was structural. She was the reason that the family continued to function around wounds that were never fully healed. The quiet maternal presence that allowed contradictions to coexist, because addressing them would have required a directness the Queen did not practice. She remained attached to Andrew, attached in the way that mothers of difficult sons remain attached, not through approval, but through an inability to sever what cannot be repaired. She tolerated Sarah's proximity. She presided over a world in which her former daughter-in-law was never fully restored to favor, yet never fully cast into the outer darkness. The trust fund for the daughters, the continued invitations to certain family gatherings, the practical tolerance of Sarah's appearances at the margins of royal life. All of these belonged to the Queen's register, maternal management rather than reform. She did not fix the problem of the Yorks. She made space around it, and that strategy, quiet, non-confrontational, built on the hope that time and avoidance would wear down what direct action might inflame, would hold for as long as she lived. It would not survive her. The Queen Mother mattered differently, and her importance grew after she was gone. In life, she had been the matriarch of Royal Lodge, the woman whose domestic authority gave the house its meaning. In death, she became the reason the house was available and the ghost whose presence made it impossible to treat the property as ordinary real estate. Her dying at Royal Lodge in 2002 transformed the house from an occupied royal residence into a chamber of inheritance, a space charged with the memory of a woman who had spent 50 years embodying a very specific idea of what a royal household should be. When Andrew moved in, he was not merely taking a lease. He was inheriting a model of domestic monarchy, and when Sarah later joined him, she was stepping into the role the Queen Mother had defined, the woman at the center of a royal home, without possessing any of the institutional authority, the public respect, or the marital status that had made that position sustainable. She had the house. She did not have the legitimacy. That gap would define everything that followed. There was also Diana. She does not belong to this family, but she belongs inescapably to this story, because Sarah Ferguson's entire public trajectory took place in Diana's shadow, and the shadow shaped the punishment. They had been friends before they were both royal, part of the same Sloane Ranger social circle, young women from the kind of English backgrounds that orbited the monarchy without quite belonging to it. They entered the family within 5 years of each other, Diana in 1981, Sarah in 1986. They were compared relentlessly in beauty, in behavior, in suffering, in the size of their divorce settlements. And the comparison was never kind to Sarah. Diana was tragic, Sarah was comic. Diana was the wronged princess, Sarah was the embarrassing duchess. Diana's pain was elevated into national mythology. Sarah's pain was flattened into tabloid farce and remained there for decades. That asymmetry mattered enormously. It meant that when Sarah's own humiliation arrived, the public consumed it not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a spectacle to be enjoyed. It meant that the institution could afford to be harsher with Sarah because the public would not protest. And it meant that Sarah's later survival, her refusal to vanish, her improbable persistence inside the very system that had tried to erase her, was achieved without this sympathy that had cushioned Diana's memory and would never be extended to her. Now the two people at the center. Andrew Albert Christian Edward was born on February 19, 1960, the third child of Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. For 22 years, he was second in line to the throne. That fact shaped the man he became in ways that would only grow fully visible decades later because it placed him in the most psychologically treacherous position the British monarchy produces. Important enough to be indulged, not important enough to be disciplined by destiny. Charles, the heir, carried the weight of a lifetime's preparation. The tutorials, the investiture at Carnarvon Castle, the decades of waiting for a role that would not arrive until he was 73 years old. Andrew carried the freedom of despair. He was educated at Heatherdown Preparatory School and then at Gordonstown, his father's old school in the Scottish Highlands, where the founding philosophy held that cold showers and physical hardship built the kind of character the British establishment valued above all others. He entered the Royal Navy, trained as a helicopter pilot, and in 1982, at the age of 22, he flew Sea King helicopters during the Falklands War, serving aboard HMS Invincible in anti-submarine and casualty evacuation operations. He came home from that war with something more durable than a campaign medal. He came home with a self-image, prince and man of action, royal birth confirmed by military service, entitlement dressed in the language of sacrifice. That self-image would prove almost impossible to dislodge. Long after the service record had faded into anecdote, and the entitlement had become the only visible part. In the mythology of the royal household, Andrew was the queen's favorite son. Whether that was literally true or simply a piece of court shorthand that hardened into received wisdom, the effect was the same. He grew up inside a structure that absorbed his errors, forgave his excesses, and allowed him to believe that the arrangements made on his behalf, the houses, the staff, the deference, the unstated assumption that doors would always open, were features of the natural order rather than privileges that could be revoked. His confidence was not the manufactured poise of a man trained for kingship. It was the unexamined certainty of a man who had never been told no with any force or finality. He was the indulged youngest son who mistook protection for permanence. That mistake would cost him everything. But the cost would come slowly, over decades, and the slowness was itself part of the problem, because each year of continued privilege reinforced the belief that the old arrangements would hold. Sarah Margaret Ferguson was born on October 15, 1959, into a world adjacent to royalty but not of it. Her father, Major Ronald Ferguson, was a polo manager first to Prince Philip and later to the Prince of Wales, a figure whose professional and social life orbited the royal household through sport, proximity, and the particular English intimacy of the polo field. The Fergusons were not titled. They were not rich in the way that the families who surrounded the monarchy were rich. They were upper class, horse and country, possessed of the social confidence that came from knowing the right people and being seen at the right events, but without the landed wealth or hereditary standing that would have made Sarah's entry into the royal family feel like consolidation rather than ascent. Her mother, Susan Barrentes, left the marriage when Sarah was young and eventually settled in Argentina. That departure marked Sarah in ways she would speak about publicly for the rest of her life: eating problems, emotional instability, a terror of abandonment that lodged itself beneath the exuberance and never fully dissolved. Those accounts matter here not as tabloid confession, but as the foundation on which everything else was built. Sarah Ferguson arrived at adulthood carrying a particular emotional architecture: warmth on the surface, need underneath, and a pattern, already established before she turned 20, of seeking belonging in structures that might not hold. She was witty, physically vivid, socially gifted, and emotionally porous. That porousness was the quality that would define her life inside the royal family. In a house that prized containment above almost everything, Sarah's instinct was exposure, not yet in the tabloid sense, but in the human sense of wanting to be seen, wanting connection to be reciprocated, wanting warmth to mean something more than protocol. Her great strength was that people liked her immediately. She was generous, funny, and genuinely kind in the ways that royal life did not always reward. Her great weakness was that she needed the liking to continue. She could not bear coldness. She could not perform the icy self-sufficiency that royal women were expected to carry through decades of public scrutiny and private loneliness. The public version of Sarah was boisterous, too loud, too tactile, too Americanized in her willingness to monetize herself despite being profoundly English and class background. The private engine was simpler and sadder. It was need for affection, need for relevance, need for money, need not to be discarded. She married upward into an institution whose deepest reflex was to punish that kind of need when it became visible, and she would spend the next 30 years proving that the punishment could not make her disappear. Princess Beatrice was born on August 8th, 1988. Princess Eugenie was born on March 23rd, 1990. They arrived into a marriage that still looked functional, a household that still carried the energy of its early promise, and a family system that had not yet decided what to do with their mother. They did not choose any of it, not the parents, not the name, not the decades of public embarrassment that would attach to the family they were born into. Beatrice, the elder, would grow into the serious daughter, the stabilizing thread, the one who tried to build something private and coherent while carrying the weight of being a York in public. Eugenie, the younger, would become the warmer, more openly expressive one, the daughter through whom Sarah's partial social rehabilitation would eventually be channeled. Together, they were the human reason that a clean severance between Sarah Ferguson and the House of Windsor was never possible. Every christening, every school event, every birthday, every wedding that involved the York daughters was an occasion on which Sarah had to be either included or visibly excluded. And exclusion carried its own cost, the cost of explaining to the public why the mother of two princesses was absent from her own children's milestones. The daughters made the problem permanent. They were the bridge the institution could not burn without burning itself. That was not their fault, it was their inheritance. Prince Charles enters this story late, but decisively. If Philip was judgment, Charles was enforcement. He was the brother who would eventually act on what had been emotionally true for years, that the York arrangement was no longer sustainable, that the old indulgences had become liabilities, and that the monarchy's credibility required a severity the Queen had been unwilling to apply. Under his reign, the remaining protections around Andrew would be dismantled. First public duty, then military patronages, then the practical use of royal titles, and finally the house itself. Charles is not the villain of this story. He is its institutional corrective, the king who inherited a family system organized around avoidance and decided at last to enforce consequences. These are the people. What follows is how they built a world together, and how the qualities that made it look like happiness were already, to the institution watching, the early symptoms of its collapse. On July 23, 1986, Prince Andrew married Sarah Ferguson at Westminster Abbey. He was 26 years old, she was 26. He was created Duke of York on his wedding day, a title that carried the echo of a previous Duke of York who had become George VI. The ceremony was grand, traditional, and watched by an estimated 500 million people worldwide. The occasion generated what the British press called Fergie Fever, and for a brief, genuine period, the warmth was real. Here was a royal bride who laughed in public, who touched her husband with visible affection, who seemed to bring something the institution had not known it needed: informality without rebellion, energy without the tortured intensity that was already defining the Wales marriage. The Yorks in the summer of 1986 looked like the monarchy's easier, sunnier branch. Less burdened, less performative, a couple who, against the odds of institutional life, appeared to actually like each other. The early years of the marriage should be understood as genuinely alive, because without that aliveness at the beginning, the later destruction carries no ache. The York household was built around Sarah's warmth and Andrew's confidence, a marriage between a woman who needed connection and a man who assumed the world would arrange itself around his comfort. Their home life before Royal Lodge, before the houses that would later define their story, was less settled than the photographs suggested. They lived initially at a series of residences, including Sunninghill Park, a new build house in Berkshire that the press quickly nicknamed South York for its ungainly architecture, a detail worth noting because it showed, even in the early years, that the Yorks attracted ridicule where other royals attracted deference. Andrew's naval career took him away for long stretches. He was posted aboard ship for weeks and sometimes months at a time. And the absences were not merely geographical, they were structural. The Navy had shaped Andrew, given him the self-image he carried most confidently, and its demands came before the marriages. Sarah, left alone inside a system designed for women who endured absence with composure and filled the time with duties, found that the openness and warmth which had made her popular were not the same thing as companionship. She was a young mother performing a public role inside an institution that rewarded stoicism, not vulnerability, and she was managing privately the older terror of being left, the terror that had lived in her since her mother walked away. What the public saw was Fergie at Ascot, Fergie on a royal tour, Fergie laughing beside her husband on the rare occasions they appeared together. What they did not see was the silence of the house when Andrew was at sea, the weight of protocol when he was on duty, and the growing knowledge, quiet but undeniable, that the marriage was built around absence. Beatrice arrived on August 8th, 1988. Eugenie followed on March 23rd, 1990. The daughters completed the picture, and for a time the picture held. The public saw a young royal family that appeared more human, more tactile, more relaxed than the senior Windsors. Photographs from this period show A couple who touched each other, who laughed in public, who let their children be seen behaving like children. Sarah's appeal remained physical and social. The red hair, the open face, the appetite for life that read to the country watching as freshness rather than vulgarity. Andrew still carried the naval glamour and the particular confidence of a man who had never been told with any conviction that he could not have what he wanted. But there is something about those early years that is worth sitting with for a moment. The very traits that made the public love Sarah, the warmth, the openness, the need for connection, the refusal to perform dignified suffering, were the same trait that inside the institution were beginning to register as warnings. She talked too freely. She moved too loosely. She was too visible, too physical, too eager. She touched people when she greeted them, not just the formal handshake, but actual warmth, actual contact. She wore clothes that the fashion press mocked and the public enjoyed. She put on weight and refused to hide it, then lost it and was photographed endlessly. Everything about her was bodily, present, unfiltered in a way that made the institution nervous, because the monarchy's deepest survival mechanism was the management of visibility, and Sarah could not be managed. The palace saw a woman who could not be contained by the role she had married into. Courtiers worried. Briefings leaked. The word unsuitable began to appear in the kind of newspaper columns that functioned as semi-official communication channels between Buckingham Palace and the public. And the press, which had spent 4 years building her up with genuine affection, was already sharpening its instruments for the next phase. There is a rhythm to the British tabloid relationship with royal women: adoration, then scrutiny, then punishment. And by the late 1980s, Sarah was entering the second stage without understanding what was coming. The tabloids had discovered that the Duchess of York sold newspaper in both directions, as a figure of delight when she was up, and as a figure of mockery when she was down. The commercial logic would push her downward because ridicule sold more reliably than admiration, and because the British public's appetite for the humiliation of women who had been raised above their station was deep, old, and largely unexamined. The marriage, meanwhile, was thinning in the quieter, less photographable way that marriage is thin when two people want different things from the same life. Andrew's absences grew longer. His naval commitments gave way to a schedule of royal duties and trade envoy work that kept him away and kept him important in his own estimation, but did not bring him home in any of the ways that mattered to Sarah. Her restlessness became harder to conceal. She traveled, socialized, sought out friendships and connections that the palace viewed with suspicion, and increasingly found that the social world available to a Duchess of York, who was not quite inside the family and not quite outside, it was a strange, compromised territory where everyone wanted something from her and very few people wanted her. The gap between the public image, the happy Yorks, the laughing Duchess, the sunlit young family, and the private reality widened with each naval deployment, each evening spent alone, each formal engagement performed with a smile that cost more than the audience knew. The family had taken shape. The daughters were born. The household existed. But the qualities that had made Sarah beloved were now, in the eyes of the institution and the press corps, circling closer: liabilities. The woman who could not stop reaching out was reaching in directions that the palace could not control. The woman who had brought warmth to the institution was generating a different kind of heat, the kind that attracted scrutiny, opportunism, and the particular male attention that would, in 1992, be photographed and published for the entire country to see. And the instrument of that punishment, a set of photographs taken in the south of France in a villa in August with a man named John Bryan, who was not her husband, had not yet been published. Bryan was an American financial advisor who had entered Sarah's orbit in the way that people entered the orbits of royal adjacent figures who were short of money and long on need, through a promise of help that became a promise of something else. The photographs that would be taken of them together, intimate, physical, and captured by a telephoto lens, would not merely end the marriage. They would change the entire register of the York story from private sadness to public farce, and they would give Philip the evidence he needed to make his judgment final. But the marriage those photographs would detonate was already failing. Sarah Ferguson was 32 years old. She had 2 daughters under the age of 4. She was living inside a system that had never quite accepted her and was now, with increasing clarity, beginning to find her inconvenient. She did not yet know that the worst was coming. She knew only that the marriage was empty, that the institution was cold, and that the warmth she had carried into royal life was not enough to heat the room she found herself in. The public fairy tale was about to become a public appetite for the most intimate kind of humiliation. And the woman at the center of it, Bugolni, the woman the tabloids had built up and were about to tear down, the woman who would spend the next 3 decades refusing to accept the punishment, had no idea how permanent the consequences would be or how long the siege she was about to begin would last. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew. And we're only just beginning. What kept it going as long as it did was the calendar. The monarchy runs on appearances, official engagements, charity patronages, state occasions, the rolling machinery of public visibility that gives the institution its only remaining justification. And Sarah, for all the private strain, was good at the public part. She had a natural warmth that worked in hospital corridors and school halls and charity galas, a physical ease with strangers that could not be taught and could not be performed by someone who did not genuinely feel it. She became patron of dozens of organizations. She threw herself into work with children's hospices and cancer research, with an energy that was partly duty, partly the desperate need to be doing something useful, and partly the instinct of a woman who had always felt most stable when she was needed. In the years between Eugenie's birth in 1990 and the collapse of 1992, Sarah's public diary was full. She was photographed at engagements across the country, visiting schools in the Midlands, touring hospitals in London, attending charity dinners where she was seated next to men who wanted to talk to a duchess and women who wanted to observe one. She smiled, she held hands, she did the work, and the work, while it lasted, gave her something the marriage no longer could: a reason to exist inside the system, a justification that did not depend on Andrew's presence or the institution's approval, but on her own capacity to be warm in a room full of people who needed warmth. There were moments during this period when the York family looked to the outside world like a functioning unit. Royal tours abroad, where Andrew and Sarah appeared together, side by side, performing the diplomatic theater of a married couple representing the crown. Photographs at Sandringham over Christmas, the family gathered on the steps, the girls in matching coats, the smiles arranged with the practiced precision that royal families deploy for cameras. Andrew at polo, Sarah in the stands, the social rituals of the season, Ascot, the Guards Polo Club, the circuit of country weekends and London dinners that constituted the social world of a young royal couple in the early 1990s. These appearances were not lies exactly. They were performances, and performances require energy, and the energy was running out. But the performances were also in their way genuine. That is what makes this period painful rather than merely cynical. Sarah loved the charity work. She was good with people in distress, instinctively kind, physically present, willing to sit with a grieving mother or a sick child in a way that did not feel like an official visit, but like a human being paying attention. Her work with children's charities and hospice organizations was noted by the organizations themselves in more than a routine patronage. She showed up. She remembered names. She followed up. In a different life or in a different institution, that quality might have been enough to sustain her position indefinitely, but the monarchy did not evaluate its members primarily on the quality of their charitable work. It evaluated them on the management of their public image, and Sarah's image by 1991 was becoming a liability that no amount of hospital visits could offset. The tabloids had shifted from affection to surveillance. Every outfit was scrutinized. Every pound of weight gained or lost was photographed and commented upon. Every social engagement was parsed for evidence of the unseemly, the inappropriate, the confirmation that this woman was not and had never been suited to the role she occupied. Andrew, meanwhile, was constructing his own version of royal importance. He had left the Navy and was beginning to develop the trade envoy identity that would later become so problematic. The role of a prince who could open doors that career diplomats could not, who could sit at tables with foreign heads of state and business leaders and lend the weight of the crown to British commercial interests. In the early 90s, this was still plausible. The Cold War had ended. Britain was positioning itself as a trading nation in a newly opened world. A prince with military credentials and royal access had genuine utility. Andrew traveled extensively to the Gulf states, to the Far East, to the kind of countries where the British royal family still carried enormous symbolic capital. He was received with deference. He was entertained lavishly. He was given the treatment that powerful people give to those they wish to impress or to use, and he mistook that treatment for personal authority in a way that would have consequences far beyond his marriage. The trade envoy work kept him busy, kept him away, and kept him convinced that his importance was not merely inherited but earned. It was another form of royal distance, another set of obligations that sounded essential and felt to Sarah like abandonment dressed in a diary. The children grew inside this atmosphere of managed absence. Beatrice, who was 3 when the marriage entered its final phase, was already showing the watchful temperament that would define her adult life. She was the child who registered the silence between her parents, who noticed when a smile was effortful, who understood, in the wordless way that small children understand, that the world her family showed the cameras and the world that existed behind the front door were not the same place. Eugenie, still a toddler, was too young for conscious understanding, but not too young for absorption. Children in troubled households develop a sonar for the emotional weather, a sensitivity to shifts in tone and temperature that they cannot name but carry in their bodies for years. The York daughters were being shaped by the marriage's decay before they had the language to know what was happening. The queen, watching from the center of the system, had not intervened. That was her method, and it had survived 40 years on the throne because it avoided the explosions that confrontation could trigger. She did not counsel Andrew about his absences. She did not take Sarah aside. She managed by continuity, by ensuring that the calendar kept turning, that the children were included in family gatherings, that the appearances held. The Queen's tolerance was not approval. It was a bet that time would either heal the wound or outlast it. But by 1991, the wound was beyond healing, and the only question was how its nature would become public. What the public did not yet know, what even parts of the household staff were still absorbing, was that the marriage had died in everything but official acknowledgement. Andrew and Sarah were occupying the same name, the same title, the same family, but they were no longer occupying the same emotional space. The distance between them had become architectural. They moved through the same houses without meeting. They attended the same events without connecting. The marriage had become a shell, maintained by the institution's horror of visible endings, and the couple's shared inability to name what was already over. That shell would hold until March 1992. Then it would crack. And once it cracked, the force behind it, a year's worth of accumulated royal catastrophe, a tabloid press hungry for royal blood, and a set of photographs that were already being taken, would blow it apart. On March 19, 1992, Buckingham Palace announced the separation of the Duke and Duchess of York. The statement was brief and carefully worded, designed to acknowledge a fact while giving away nothing about the feeling behind it. Andrew and Sarah were separating. The Duchess would continue to carry out her public duties. The couple would share responsibility for their children. The language was administrative. The reality was wreckage, not the sudden, dramatic wreckage of a single betrayal, but the slow structural failure of a marriage that had been emptying for years and had finally been acknowledged as empty. The separation changed Sarah's position inside the household immediately and in ways both visible and invisible. Officially, she remained the Duchess of York. Officially, her public duties continued, but the internal calculus had shifted. She was now a separated woman inside a family that did not separate. A family whose public authority depended on the maintenance of permanence, continuity, and the fiction that royal marriages, once blessed by God and the Church of England, endured. The courtiers who managed the family's public image began to recalculate. The invitations that had been automatic became conditional. The access that had been assumed became negotiated. Sarah found herself occupying a space that was neither inside nor outside. Still the Duchess, still the mother, still present at official functions, but surrounded by the unmistakable atmosphere of institutional withdrawal. People who had been warm became careful. People who had been careful became cold. And the tabloid press, which had been circling for years, now had official permission to treat her not as a young duchess in a difficult marriage, but as a problem the monarchy was in the process of solving. The timing was catastrophic, but not because of anything Sarah had done. 1992 was already shaping into the worst year of the Queen's reign. Princess Anne's divorce from Captain Mark Phillips had been finalized that April. The Prince and Princess of Wales were in the terminal phase of their own public disintegration. Andrew Morton's biography of Diana, serialized in the Sunday Times in June, would detonate the last fiction of a functioning Wales marriage, with explosive first person testimony that Diana had secretly authorized. And in November, a fire would rip through the state apartments at Windsor Castle, damaging more than 100 rooms and producing a restoration bill of £36.5 million that became a furious public argument about who should pay for the upkeep of royal property. The monarchy in 1992 was under siege from every direction, from divorce, from exposure, from fire, from the growing public suspicion that the institution cost more than it was worth and gave back less than it claimed. The Queen would later call it her annus horribilis, and the phrase entered the language because it captured something the country already felt, that the fairy tale had collapsed and the people inside it were no better at managing their private lives than anyone else. Into that atmosphere of institutional vulnerability came the photographs. The sequence of events has to be understood in its physical detail, because the detail is what gave the scandal its particular force. In August 1992, Sarah was on holiday in the south of France with her daughters and with John Bryan. Bryan was an American financial advisor, a Texan, a man who had entered Sarah's life through the overlapping worlds of money, social access, and the kind of male attention that presented itself as professional help and became personal entanglement. He had been advising her on her financial difficulties, the debts, the obligations, the shortfall between what a Duchess of York was expected to maintain and what a separated Duchess of York could actually afford. The advisory relationship had become intimate. They were staying at a villa near Saint-Tropez, a rented property in the kind of moneyed Mediterranean landscape where the British upper classes had always gone to behave in ways they would not countenance at home. The children were there, staff were there, and a photographer, working with a telephoto lens from a distance that made consent irrelevant, was capturing images that would reshape Sarah Ferguson's public identity for the rest of her life. The photographs were published in the Daily Mirror on August 20th, 1992. They showed Sarah and Bryan in intimate physical contact by the swimming pool. The most widely reproduced image showed Bryan appearing to kiss or suck Sarah's toes as she reclined, semi-undressed in the sun. The children were visible in some of the frames. The images were not explicit in the legal sense. No prosecution was ever brought. No obscenity threshold was crossed. But they were devastating in the social sense because they violated every code that the British class system applied to the behavior of women in positions of public trust. A duchess, a mother of princesses, a woman who still bore the royal name. And the photographs gave the country permission to do what it had been preparing to do for years: laugh at her. The morning the pictures broke, the royal family was at Balmoral. That detail matters because Balmoral is the monarchy at its most private. The Scottish Highlands estate, where the family gathers each August, away from the public calendar, inside the rituals of shooting, walking, picnicking on the moors, and the kind of family togetherness that the Windsors practiced as both tradition and performance. The castle sits on 50,000 acres of Aberdeenshire countryside, surrounded by hills, rivers, and the particular Scottish quiet that the royal family had sought out since Victoria and Albert first fell in love with the Highlands in the 1840s. It is the place where the family is supposed to be most itself, most private, most protected from the outside world. And it was into that sanctuary on the morning of August 20th, 1992, that the newspapers were carried. By several accounts, the papers were brought in with breakfast, laid out on the dining table in the way that broadsheets and tabloids had been laid out for the family every morning for as long as anyone could remember. The images were seen by the household together, the Queen, Philip, Charles, other members of the family and their guests, in the same room, at the same hour, on the same morning that every breakfast table in the country was seeing them too. Sarah was at Balmoral. She was in the castle when the papers arrived. She was, by the accounts that emerged later through palace sources and carefully attributed briefings, in the room. The photographs of her body, her intimacy, her private physical life with another man were being consumed by her in laws at a breakfast table, while the same images were being consumed by the nation at a million other breakfast tables. The humiliation was not abstract, it was spatial, physical, simultaneous. She was sitting with the people who were seeing her at her most exposed, and the silence that followed, by every account, a silence so total and so sustained that it functioned as a courtroom verdict, was the sound of a family making a judgment it would not reverse for decades. Philip's response, by the accounts that accumulated over the following years and decades, was not explosive but glacial. It was the cold, permanent fury of a man who saw the photographs as confirmation of everything he had believed about Sarah from the beginning, that she was unsuitable, reckless, incapable of the self-governance that royal status demanded. Philip could have tolerated, perhaps, a discreet affair. The British monarchy had survived centuries of discreet affairs. What it could not survive in Philip's framework was ridicule. The telephoto lens, the swimming pool, the toes, the children in the background of the frame. The photographs did not merely embarrass the family, they made the family absurd. And for Philip, for whom the maintenance of the monarchy's dignity was a moral commitment and not a social preference, absurdity was the unforgivable offense. After August 1992, Sarah Ferguson was, in the eyes of the man who embodied the family's highest code, beyond redemption. The estrangement that followed, whether literal, as press reports repeatedly claimed, or more complex in its domestic reality, would last for decades. It would not fully break until the events around Eugenie's wedding in 2018, a quarter of a century later. The public response was not sympathy, it was sport. The tabloids ran the story for days. The broadsheets ran commentary pieces about royal decline. The comedians added the toe-sucking to their routines. Sarah was mocked with a thoroughness that went beyond ordinary tabloid cruelty because the photographs offered something the British class system found irresistible. The spectacle of a woman who had been elevated above her station, falling in the most physical, most bodily, most undignified way possible. The word Fergie, which had once been affectionate, it became a punchline. The toe-sucking became shorthand, a single detail by which millions of people who knew nothing else about Sarah Ferguson's marriage, motherhood, charity work, or emotional life would define her for the next 30 years. A woman with a history, a decade of public service, two small daughters, and years of private loneliness was compressed into one image and one joke. That compression was the real violence of the scandal, because it erased everything else. And what it replaced the full picture with was a caricature so powerful that Sarah would spend the rest of her public life unable to escape it. The institution's response was quieter and more administrative, but in some ways more devastating than any public confrontation would have been. The Queen did not publicly denounce Sarah. She did not stage a dramatic confrontation or issue a statement of condemnation. She allowed the separation to continue on its existing terms and ensured that Beatrice and Eugenie's daily lives were disrupted as little as the circumstances permitted. But the photographs changed the internal calculus permanently. Sarah was no longer a daughter-in-law who might, with time and careful management, be rehabilitated into a functional role within the institution. She was a problem that could only be contained, not solved. And the containment would be achieved not through any single act of exclusion, but through a slow, systemic withdrawal that was all the more painful for being undramatic. The machinery of royal belonging, which operates not through announcements, but through the silent language of invitations sent and not sent, of telephone calls returned and not returned, of which residences are made available for weekend visits and which are quietly closed, of who is seated where at a dinner and who receives the brief warmth of the Queen's attention in a receiving line, began to reposition Sarah at the outermost edge of the family's orbit. The warmth that had once existed, however imperfect, was withdrawn. The small courtesies were reduced. Certain staff members who had been friendly became professionally distant. The access to the family's private calendar, the shooting weekends, the informal suppers, the after-church gatherings at Sandringham narrowed Nobody told Sarah she was banished. Nobody needed to. The system communicated its verdicts through absence, through the gradual removal of the things that had once made her feel, however tenuously, that she belonged. And Sarah found herself in a position that would become achingly familiar over the next 3 decades, still technically part of the family, still the mother of two princesses, still carrying the ducal title, and yet treated in every practical sense that mattered, as someone who had been asked to leave but refused to hear the instruction. The divorce took nearly 4 more years. The decree was finalized on May 30th, 1996, and the terms confirmed what the public had suspected and what Sarah had feared. By contemporary reporting, she received an annual settlement of roughly £500,000 and a £1.5 million trust for the daughter's education and welfare. There was no lump sum of the kind Diana would negotiate. There was no property settlement that would give her independent security. There was no London residence of her own. There was instead a maintenance structure that kept her dependent on the very system that had already decided she was a liability. The loss of the HRH style, she would remain Duchess of York but could no longer be addressed as Her Royal Highness, was presented by the palace as a formality, a matter of protocol rather than punishment. In practice, it was a demotion in the only currency her world truly valued. In the stratified universe of the British aristocracy and its royal apex, the three letters HRH were not merely a courtesy. They were a signal to embassies, to event organizers, to the social world that managed seating plans and guest lists, about where a person stood in the order of things. Without them, Sarah's standing dropped. Doors that had opened on the strength of those initials now required a separate justification for being open. She was downgraded, not annihilated, excluded ceremonially, but bound maternally through Beatrice and Eugenie. The institution had tried to solve the problem of Sarah Ferguson through legal severance, a clean cut that would preserve the children's royal status while reducing their mother to private irrelevance. Life, as it always did with the Yorks, refused to cooperate. The early post-divorce years were defined by money and by the stubborn refusal to accept the verdict. Sarah's financial position was precarious in ways the public, which still saw her at events and in newspapers, did not grasp. She had a title, obligations, and the residual costs of a life at the edges of royalty, but she did not have the capital to sustain any of it independently. The gap between what she appeared to possess and what she actually controlled was immense, and it drove her into a cycle that would repeat for the next 2 decades. Commercial ventures, endorsement deals, book contracts, speaking engagements, the constant monetization of the only asset she retained, which was her name and the story attached to it. She became a spokeswoman for Weight Watchers, appearing in American television advertisements with a cheerfulness that masked the desperation of the underlying transaction. She wrote children's books. The Budgie the Little Helicopter series had already begun during the marriage. And she wrote memoirs that sold on the promise of royal insider knowledge. She gave paid speeches on the international circuit, appearing at corporate events and charity dinners in the United States and across Europe, offering the peculiar commodity that only a disgraced duchess could sell: the appearance of royal glamour combined with the relatability of public failure. She was, in commercial terms, a brand. The brand was Fergie, warm, fallible, game for anything, willing to laugh at herself because the alternative was to acknowledge how much the laughter hurt. The public saw a woman who seemed unable to stop hustling and judged her for it. The truth was that she could not afford to stop. Debt accumulated through the late 90s, and various reports placed it between £3 and £5 million, depending on the source and the year. She owed money to banks, to credit card companies, to individuals who had extended her the kind of financial courtesy offered to those with famous names and withdrawn the moment the name stops working as collateral. The cycle was vicious and self-reinforcing. She needed money to maintain the life her status demanded: the clothes, the travel, the appearances, the practical costs of raising two princesses in a manner consistent with their rank. She could not earn money without commercializing herself in ways that further damaged her status in the eyes of the institution. And the further the status fell, the less her name was worth on the market that was keeping her solvent. She was a duchess running on fumes, and the fumes were getting thinner. And yet Diana's story ran in parallel, and the contrast cut deep into everything Sarah endured. Diana, who had left the same institution under conditions of similar personal catastrophe, had negotiated a settlement of approximately £17 million, a sum that allowed her to live independently in Kensington Palace, with staff, with security, with a public profile that the country treated not with ridicule, but with reverence. Diana's suffering was received as tragedy. Her beauty was treated as evidence of her victimhood. Her pain was elevated into national mythology, the wronged princess whose private anguish somehow ennobled her in the public imagination. Sarah received none of that. Sarah's suffering was farce. Sarah's body was comedy. Sarah's pain was something to be laughed at, not mourned. The disparity was not accidental. It reflected something deep in the way the British public related to royal women, a distinction between the beautiful and the not beautiful, the elegant and the ungainly, the tragic and the comic, that had nothing to do with the actual severity of each woman's experience and everything to do with the country's appetite for certain kinds of stories about certain kinds of women. When Diana died in Paris on August 31st, 1997, the nation convulsed with a grief so intense that it reshaped the monarchy's relationship with public emotion for a generation. The outpouring was extraordinary. The flowers at Kensington Palace, the public weeping, the pressure on the Queen to respond with a display of feeling that did not come naturally to her or her institution. Sarah, watching from outside the inner circle, had lost one of the very few people who had understood what it meant to be a woman consumed and discarded by the House of Windsor. They had been friends before they were rivals, before the institution set them against each other, before the tabloids made them competing archetypes. Diana's death removed the only real comparison figure whose fate might have made the public see Sarah's suffering as something other than entertainment. After 1997, Sarah was alone in a way she had not been before, the only divorced royal wife still visible, still carrying the public weight of institutional humiliation, and now without even the possibility that someone inside the same experience might understand. But she did not disappear. That is the fact that gives the rest of this story its shape, and it is a fact that requires explanation, because the forces arranged against her were not trivial. Every mechanism in the system, the tabloid mockery, the palace briefings that placed unflattering stories with sympathetic journalists, Philip's unbroken contempt, the financial pressure that should have driven her into retreat, the cultural appetite for her humiliation that showed no sign of diminishing, pointed toward a single conclusion. Sarah Ferguson should have gone. She should have retreated into a quiet life outside the frame, accepted the diminished settlement, raised the girls without claiming proximity to the family that had publicly rejected her, and faded into the particular English oblivion reserved for disgraced, former wives of powerful men. She did none of that. She kept appearing, she kept talking, she kept working every commercial avenue available to her. She kept insisting, through action, if not always through articulation, that she was still connected to the family, still the mother of the daughters, still someone who belonged near the rooms she was no longer formally invited to enter. The refusal was not elegant. It was not strategic in any way a publicist would have designed. It was raw, instinctive, and powered by the same engine that had always driven her. The need not to be discarded, the need to matter, the need to remain. What the institution had intended as a controlled downgrade, a legal severance that would preserve the children's status while reducing their mother to an irrelevance, was becoming something else entirely. The divorced couple continued to co-parent. They continued to appear at the same family events. They continued in ways that baffled the palace and irritated the press to function as a domestic unit long after the marriage had been legally dissolved. Sarah spent time at Andrew's residences. She attended family occasions that she was strictly speaking no longer entitled to attend. She behaved, in other words, as though the divorce had altered her legal status but not her practical position, as though the family she had married into remained, in some fundamental sense, her family too. And within a few years, the question that no one at Buckingham Palace wanted to confront would become impossible to avoid. If the institution had expelled Sarah Ferguson, why did she keep ending up back inside the house? And what would happen when the house itself, the Queen Mother's house, the 30-room residence in Windsor Great Park that carried half a century of royal domestic memory, became available for a new kind of York arrangement that nobody had authorized and nobody quite knew how to stop? The answer, when it came, was not dramatic. It arrived in the form of paperwork, builders, and the slow conversion of a dead woman's house into a living family's fortress. The Queen Mother had died at Royal Lodge on March 30th, 2002. The mourning was national and genuine. She had been the last living link to the generation that had endured the Second World War from inside the monarchy. The woman who had walked through the bombed streets of the East End and refused to leave London when the palace itself was hit. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of thousands. Her memory was treated with the reverence that the British reserve for figures who embody an older, more certain version of the national character. And when the mourning ended, the house she had occupied for half a century stood empty. Andrew had taken the lease. The refurbishment had been completed over the following years. And by the middle of the decade, the house that had once been the quiet center of the older Windsor matriarchy had become something else entirely. The physical expression of the York refusal to accept the terms of their own downfall. The details of the lease had already been established. What mattered now was what it felt like to live inside the arrangement and what it did to the family dynamics that had been circling the same unresolved question since 1992. When Sarah moved in, the shift was less a single dramatic event than a gradual thickening of presence. She had been visiting. She had been staying for weekends. She had been around, and at Christmas, during school holidays, for the girls' birthdays, in the loose domestic rhythm that the York co-parenting arrangement had produced over the preceding years. She would arrive on a Friday evening and leave on a Monday morning, and then the Monday departures became less regular. And then the distinction between staying and living dissolved entirely. The boundary between visiting and residing blurred over months rather than days, until by 2008 it was clear to anyone paying attention, to the household staff, to the protection officers, to the neighbors in Windsor Great Park, that Sarah Ferguson was not a guest at Royal Lodge in any meaningful sense of the word. She was a resident. She was managing domestic arrangements. She was there when Andrew was away and there when he returned. She was, in everything but legal and marital status, the woman of the house, the wife without the marriage, the duchess without the HRH, the occupant without the lease. And that arrangement, once it solidified, became extraordinarily difficult to undo, because undoing it would have required someone, Andrew, the Queen, the institution itself, to name what was happening, and naming it would have meant confronting the fact that the divorce, the settlement, the careful legal severance of 1996 had achieved nothing of consequence. The family was back together. It had simply reorganized itself around the same house under a different legal fiction. The domestic reality at Royal Lodge during these years has never been fully documented from the inside. No memoir has been published. No staff account has provided the kind of intimate detail that would allow a definitive portrait of how the household functioned day to day. What is known from the accumulation of press reporting, authorized and unauthorized interviews, and the testimony of people who visited is that the arrangement worked. Not as a romantic reconciliation. Andrew and Sarah did not resume their marriage in any formal sense, and both have denied, at various points, that their relationship was anything other than a close friendship built on shared parenthood and a mutual stubbornness about the way they wished to live. But as a domestic system, it functioned with the kind of quiet efficiency that makes outsiders wonder why the relationship ended in the first place. The house was large enough to accommodate separate lives under the same roof. 30 rooms across multiple floors, with enough space for privacy, for staff, for the daily logistics of a household that included 2 adults, 2 young women, dogs, guests, and the ceaseless administrative apparatus of a duke's correspondence and a duchess's diary. The children moved between their parents without the disruption that separate residences across London and the home counties would have imposed. The staff managed the household with the discretion that royal adjacent service demands. Meals were shared. Holidays were spent together. Christmas was spent as a family. And Sarah, who had spent the years between 1996 and 2008 hustling for money and relevance in an increasingly hostile public landscape. appearing on American television, signing book deals, giving speeches to corporate audiences who paid to hear a duchess talk about resilience. Found in Royal Lodge something she had not possessed since before the divorce: stability, a home, a place where she was not performing, not selling, not managing the gap between what she had and what she owed. A base from which to operate, and around which to organize the two things that mattered most to her: her daughters and her continued proximity to the family that had tried to push her out. The house did not make her rich. It did not restore her status. It did not undo the photographs or the debt or the years of tabloid punishment, but it gave her ground to stand on. And for Sarah Ferguson, who had spent a decade without any, that was enough. The palace tolerated the arrangement with the particular blend of silence and avoidance that characterized the Queen's approach to family problems she could not solve without creating worse problems in the process. Nobody at Buckingham Palace endorsed the York domestic setup. Nobody publicly defended it. Nobody explained to the press or the public why a divorced duchess, who had been stripped of her HRH, who had been the subject of a humiliation that the family had never forgiven, was now living in one of the crown's most prestigious residential properties with the ex-husband whose status depended on the very institution she had embarrassed. Senior courtiers, by later reporting, regarded the arrangement with a frustration that bordered on contempt. Not because they thought Sarah was a threat to the monarchy, but because the York situation embodied precisely the kind of messy, unresolved, emotionally driven family compromise that made the institution look weak. The monarchy's authority depended on the appearance of order, and the Yorks were disorder incarnate: a divorced couple living as a family, a disgraced duchess installed in a crown-linked house, a prince whose status was being quietly eroded by his own behavior, and a domestic arrangement that nobody had authorized, nobody controlled, and nobody could end without provoking a confrontation with the Queen herself. Because that was the ultimate protection. Not Andrew's lease, not Sarah's persistence, not even the daughter's emotional leverage. It was the Queen. As long as Elizabeth II was alive and on the throne, the York arrangement was shielded by the one authority that no courtier, no prime minister, and no fellow member of the royal family could override. The Queen did not approve of what was happening at Royal Lodge, but she was unwilling to dismantle it because dismantling it would have meant hurting Andrew, hurting the granddaughters, and forcing a public reckoning with a family failure that her entire style of governance was designed to avoid. The silence was not approval. It was exhaustion masquerading as patience, and it depended on the assumption that the status quo, however uncomfortable, was less damaging than the alternative. That assumption would hold until it couldn't. But for now, the house held, the arrangement held, and the monarchy, which had spent a decade trying to manage the York problem, quietly accepted that the problem had managed them. Beatrice and Eugenie, meanwhile, were growing up inside this arrangement in ways that would shape their adult lives profoundly. Beatrice was entering her teenage years as a princess who carried a title that attracted public attention and a surname that increasingly attracted public embarrassment. She was educated at St. George's School in Ascot, then at Goldsmiths University of London, where she read history. She was watchful, composed, and determined to build an adult life that was not defined by her parents' catastrophes. Eugenie, 2 years younger, attended Marlborough College and then Newcastle University, where she studied art history and English. She was warmer in public than her sister, more openly affectionate with both parents, more willing to be seen and photographed in family contexts. The sisters developed through adolescence and into young adulthood a survival strategy that was never articulated as such, but was visible in everything they did. Be present, be correct, be seen at the right occasions, give the press nothing to attack, and above all, do not let the York name become your only identity. It was a strategy born of necessity. They had watched their mother be mocked for decades. They had watched their father's reputation shift from naval hero to national joke. They knew, in the way that children of public disgrace always know, that the world was watching them for signs of the same weakness. The daughters also served a structural function in the York arrangement that the palace could not publicly acknowledge but could not escape. Every milestone in their lives, every birthday, every school event, every public appearance, every invitation that required a parental presence was an occasion on which the question of Sarah's inclusion had to be negotiated. Was the mother of the princess invited to the christening? Or was she present at the school play? Would she be visible at the graduation ceremony, standing beside Andrew, looking for all the world like a couple who had never divorced? Was she to be seated at the family table at Christmas, or in some adjacent room that acknowledged her presence without quite conferring belonging? Each event became a miniature diplomatic crisis for the palace officials who managed the family's public image, because including Sarah risked appearing to rehabilitate her, while excluding her risked appearing cruel to the daughters. And cruelty to princesses was the one form of institutional behavior that the British public would not tolerate, even in the case of princesses whose mother they had spent years mocking. The children, simply by existing and by growing up and by having lives that required their mother, kept the door to the family permanently ajar. They were the mechanism by which Sarah's refusal to disappear was converted into the institution's inability to make her, Beatrice's confirmation, Eugenie's school sports day, a parent-teacher evening at St. George's, a family photograph at Sandringham. These were not grand state occasions. They were the ordinary fabric of childhood, and they accumulated into something the palace could not override, a pattern of maternal presence so deeply woven into the daughters' lives that removing it would have required a cruelty that even the most ruthless institutional logic could not justify. And the longer the arrangement lasted, the more entrenched it became, until by the late 2000s, the idea of separating Sarah from the York household had become not merely difficult, but structurally impossible without inflicting visible damage on Beatrice and Eugenie. Damage that the Queen, who loved her granddaughters and understood the fragility of the arrangement that sustained them, was not willing to inflict. Then, in May 2010, the arrangement's fragility was exposed from a direction that Sarah had not anticipated and could not control. On the 23rd, the News of the World published footage from a hidden camera sting operation that had been months in the making. An undercover reporter, Mazar Mahmood, a journalist whose career was built on the entrapment of public figures, and who would later be convicted of perverting the course of justice in an unrelated case, had posed as a wealthy Indian businessman seeking access to Prince Andrew for commercial purposes. He had arranged meetings with Sarah. He had offered money, and he had recorded everything. The footage showed Sarah in a private setting, a hotel room, curtains drawn, the atmosphere of a transaction conducted in the belief of privacy, discussing financial terms with a fluency that suggested this was not the first time she had thought in these numbers. She referred to Andrew's potential usefulness. She discussed what access to the Duke of York might be worth to a foreign businessman. She appeared to negotiate a fee of £500,000 for the introduction, and she was filmed accepting a cash payment of £40,000 as an initial installment, the notes handed over in the kind of scene that looks, on camera, exactly like what it was, a woman in financial distress, selling the only asset she had left. The footage was damning not because it revealed corruption in the grand sense. No state secret was traded. No government policy was influenced. No official channel was compromised. It was damning because it collapsed the last distinction between need and opportunism that Sarah had been trying to maintain since the divorce. Here was a duchess living in a royal house, offering to sell access to a prince on camera for cash. The transaction was not subtle. It was not deniable. It was not susceptible to the kind of reinterpretation that palace communication staff might have been able to manage if the evidence had been circumstantial. It was recorded, broadcast, and replayed until the image of Sarah Ferguson accepting banknotes in a hotel room became as fixed in the public memory as the South of France photographs had been 18 years earlier. Sarah's response was immediate and wretched. She appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show, American television, the confessional arena of choice for disgraced public figures who had exhausted the more restrained British options, and issued an apology that was both abject and revealing. She described herself as being in a difficult and painful situation. She acknowledged that her behavior had been idiotic. She said she had been drinking. She said she was in financial distress and had not been thinking clearly. She said she was sincerely sorry, and that Andrew had no knowledge of the meeting or the negotiation. The apology was widely reported and widely disbelieved, not because people thought she was lying about the drinking or the distress, but because the incident confirmed what her critics had always claimed, that Sarah Ferguson's relationship with the royal family had always been at some level transactional, that her continued presence in the house, her insistence on proximity, her decades-long refusal to disappear, was motivated not by family loyalty or maternal devotion, but by the commercial calculation that being near a prince was worth more than being away from one, that reading was unfair, or at least radically incomplete. The cash for access sting emerged from a particular set of pressures that had been building for 15 years without any institutional mechanism to relieve them. The debts had never been resolved. The commercial landscape had dried up as Sarah's public reputation deteriorated and the market for disgraced Duchess memoirs and speaking engagements contracted. The maintenance settlement from the divorce had not been restructured to reflect her actual costs, and the gap between what she needed and what she received had widened year by year until the desperation was not occasional but permanent. Sarah was not a sophisticated criminal operating a bribery network. She was a woman who had been financially precarious since 1996, who had exhausted the respectable avenues of self-support, and who had made a catastrophically bad decision in a moment when the pressure exceeded her capacity for good judgment. The scene should be understood with both its components visible at once. The behavior was indefensible, and the circumstances that produced it were the predictable consequence of a system that had downgraded a woman's status without giving her the means to survive the downgrade. The monarchy had created the conditions for Sarah's desperation, and then recoiled in horror when the desperation produced exactly the kind of behavior the conditions had made inevitable. The immediate consequences were severe, but in a pattern that had become characteristic of the York story, not terminal. The palace distanced itself with the speed and precision of an institution that had long practice in managing the gap between private embarrassment and public statement. Andrew issued a public response, making clear that he had no involvement in and no knowledge of the arrangement. The press ran the story for weeks, recycling the footage, commissioning commentary pieces, and producing the kind of editorial content that treated Sarah's behavior as confirmation of a thesis about royal entitlement and moral decay that the newspapers had been advancing for years. Sarah's remaining public credibility, already threadbare from the accumulated weight of 2 decades of scandal and mockery, took another blow that should, by any rational calculation, have been the final one. Her charity patrons reviewed their associations. Corporate speaking engagements dried up further. The commercial value of the Fergie brand, which had been her primary source of independent income, dropped toward a level where the economics of survival became genuinely precarious. And yet, once again, she did not vanish. The arrangement at Royal Lodge continued. The co-parenting continued. The domestic system that the palace had never sanctioned and never dismantled absorbed the shock and carried on, as it had absorbed every previous shock. The photographs, the divorce, the debt, the tabloid humiliation, and continued. The institution's failure to remove Sarah after the cash for access sting was perhaps the most revealing moment in the entire saga, because it demonstrated that the York problem had become genuinely unsolvable within the existing power structure. Ejecting Sarah from Royal Lodge would have required ejecting Andrew from Royal Lodge, and ejecting Andrew would have required a confrontation with the Queen's favorite son. A confrontation that the Queen would not initiate, that the courtiers could not force, and that Charles, who was still Prince of Wales and heir rather than king, did not yet have the authority to impose. The house held, the arrangement held. The scandal was absorbed into the long York pattern of catastrophe, followed by survival, followed by the quiet resumption of a life that nobody outside Royal Lodge could quite understand, and nobody inside it seemed willing to change. The years between 2010 and 2018 were, by York standards, a period of relative stability, which meant merely that no single incident broke through into the kind of crisis that demanded an institutional response. Sarah continued to live at Royal Lodge. She continued her commercial activities, though at a lower public profile and with the chastened caution of a woman who had been burned by her own desperation. She wrote more books, novels now, romantic fiction published under her own name. Stories set against backdrops of aristocratic intrigue, historical romance, and the textures of a world she had inhabited and been expelled from. The books were not literary. They were not critically acclaimed. But they sold modestly, and they gave her something to be other than a scandalous duchess, an author, a working woman, a person with a professional identity that did not depend entirely on the name she had married into. She maintained her charity connections where she could, though the list of organizations willing to be associated with her name was shorter than it had been. She traveled. She appeared at events where her presence was welcome rather than controversial. She aged. She endured. And she was photographed less often, mentioned less frequently in the newspapers, and settled into the strange twilight position that the monarchy reserves for people it cannot accommodate and cannot remove, visible enough to be occasionally embarrassing, invisible enough to be mostly ignored. Philip, during these years, remained implacable. The estrangement that had begun at Balmoral in August 1992 held through the 2000s and into the 2010s, with a consistency that suggested it was not merely personal anger, but a position of principle. Philip was aging. He was in his 90s, still attending engagements, still formidable in his bearing and his opinions. And the passage of time, which softens most resentments, appeared to have had no effect on his view of his former daughter in law. Sarah was still, in the Philip Windsor framework, the woman who had made the family ridiculous, and the fact that she was now living quietly in the family's own house only deepened the offense. The Philip thread matters because it kept alive, through all the years of domestic stability, the underlying truth that the York arrangement was tolerated but not accepted. The silence around it was not peace. It was a ceasefire that depended on nobody testing its terms. Beatrice and Eugenie, meanwhile, were building their adult lives with the quiet determination of women who understood exactly what they were inheriting and were resolved not to be destroyed by it. Beatrice worked in finance and technology, maintaining a public profile that was minimal by royal standards and carefully controlled. She began a relationship with Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi, a property developer from an Italian noble family, and the relationship carried an implicit message that Beatrice was building a life whose foundations were her own, not her parents'. Eugenie moved into the art world, working at galleries in London and New York, and began a relationship with Jack Brooksbank, a brand manager for a tequila company whose affability and lack of pretension stood in deliberate contrast to the drama of the family he was joining. The sisters were, in their different ways, doing what the children of damaged families always try to do: build something stable on ground that their parents had made unstable. Eugenie's wedding on October 12, 2018, became the moment when the long York exile appeared at last to have been outlasted. It was not a reconciliation. It was not a formal restoration. But it was the closest thing to vindication that Sarah Ferguson had experienced in 26 years, and the emotional weight of the occasion was felt by everyone present. The ceremony was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, the same chapel where Harry and Meghan had married 5 months earlier, the same sacred space where generations of Windsors had been christened, married, and mourned, the chapel whose 15th century stonework and royal tombs gave every event held within it the gravity of continuity. Eugenie married Jack Brooksbank in an autumn ceremony attended by the Queen, by Philip, by the Prince of Wales, by the Cambridges, by the full ceremonial apparatus of the House of Windsor in its formal mode. 800 guests filled the chapel. The bride wore a gown by Peter Pilotto and Christopher DeVos that left her back exposed. A deliberate choice, because Eugenie had undergone surgery for scoliosis at the age of 12, and the dress was her way of showing the scar rather than hiding it. That detail belonged to Eugenie's own story, but it also spoke to a broader York quality: the willingness to let the body tell the truth, to refuse the concealment that the institution preferred. And Sarah was there, not at the margins, not in a side pew with a diplomatic gap between herself and the rest of the family. She was the mother of the bride. She was seated in the front row. She was visible, composed, dressed in a green outfit that the fashion press would scrutinize and the tabloids would comment on. But what mattered was not the clothes. What mattered was the position. After decades of institutional distance, Sarah Ferguson was sitting inside the chapel at Windsor Castle at a royal wedding in the place that the mother of the bride occupied by right, and no one had tried to stop her. The pre-wedding celebrations, by press reporting, centered on Royal Lodge itself. The evening before the ceremony, a dinner was held at the house. The fortress of York, domestic survival, opened for the occasion and serving for one evening as the setting for a family celebration at which Sarah was not a tolerated presence but a host. The guest moved through the rooms that the Queen Mother had once occupied, that Andrew had refurbished, that Sarah had made her home for a decade. The house, for one night, was not a scandal or a question about privilege. It was a family home doing what family homes are supposed to do, holding people together for an occasion that mattered. The coverage in the days that followed dwelt on one detail above all others: how Philip was there. Philip, who had not been in the same public frame as Sarah for years, who by every account had refused her company since the Balmoral breakfast in 1992, was at his granddaughter's wedding in a context where Sarah's proximity was unavoidable. Press photographers captured them in overlapping space for what was widely reported as the first time in 26 years. Whether Philip's presence constituted reconciliation, reluctant tolerance, or simply the pragmatic recognition that a 97-year-old man could not boycott his own granddaughter's wedding without creating a scandal worse than the one he was trying to avoid, the meaning was legible. Sarah had outlasted the exile, not through confrontation, not through negotiation, not through any dramatic act of restoration, but through the simplest and most exhausting strategy available. She had endured. She had remained present in her daughters' lives long enough for the daughter's milestone to require her presence. She had converted maternal indispensability into something that looked, from the right angle and in the right light, like a kind of victory. For a brief period after the wedding, the York story looked as though it might settle into something quieter. The house was stable. The daughters were married or marrying. Beatrice's wedding to Edoardo Mapelli-Mozzi would follow in July 2020, a smaller ceremony constrained by pandemic restrictions, but significant in its own way, a union that anchored the elder daughter in a life independent of the York dysfunction. The grandchildren were beginning to arrive. Eugenie's son, Auguste, was born in February 2021. Beatrice's daughter, Sienna, followed in September of the same year. And Eugenie's second son, Ernest, arrived in 2023. The York branch was producing a new generation. And new generations have a way of softening old resentments by replacing them with the practical demands of christenings, first steps, birthday parties, and the ordinary forward motion of family life continuing beyond the crises that had threatened to define it. Philip died on April 9th, 2021, at the age of 99. His death removed a man who had, more than any other individual, embodied the institutional rejection of Sarah Ferguson. Whether his passing changed the internal dynamics of the family, whether the disappearance of his implacable judgment created space for a warmer accommodation of the York arrangement, is not a question that public reporting has answered definitively. What can be said is that the removal of the family's most severe conscience coincided with a period in which the pressures on the York domestic settlement were about to intensify from an entirely different direction. Because the appearance of stability was an illusion, and the illusion was about to shatter from the direction that Sarah had always feared most. The house that had protected her for a decade, the house that had made her long post-divorce survival physically possible, the house that had given her ground to stand on when every other surface had been pulled away, did not belong to her. It belonged to Andrew. And Andrew's world was about to collapse in a way that would make the toe-sucking photographs and the cash for access sting look like minor embarrassments from a gentler era. The same institutional machinery that had tolerated the York arrangement for years, that had looked away, made space, managed by avoidance, was about to discover that tolerance had a limit. And the limit was not Sarah Ferguson's behavior. It was not her debts or her commercial ventures or her presence in the house. It was her ex-husband's. The catastrophe that was coming belonged to Andrew. But the consequences, as always in the York story, would land on everyone who lived inside the arrangement he had built. The catastrophe arrived on a Saturday evening in November 2019. And it arrived because Andrew invited it in. On the 16th, the BBC broadcast a pre-recorded interview between Prince Andrew and Emily Maitlis for the program Newsnight. The interview had been arranged by Andrew in his private office, specifically by his then private secretary Amanda Thirsk, against the explicit advice of Buckingham Palace's communications team, who had argued that any public discussion of the Epstein Association carried uncontrollable risk, Andrew overruled them. That detail mattered enormously because it meant that the catastrophe was not ambushed, but chosen. Andrew had decided, apparently with the confidence of a man who had spent a lifetime being deferred to and shielded from the consequences of his own poor judgment, that he could go on national television, sit in a room at Buckingham Palace itself, and explain his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted sex offender who had died in a Manhattan jail cell 3 months earlier, in terms that the British public would accept. He believed by later reporting that his account was compelling, that his manner would be persuasive, and that the interview would draw a line under the Epstein question that had been dogging him for years. He was catastrophically, comprehensively wrong. The interview was filmed in the South Drawing Room at Buckingham Palace. The setting was itself a statement, a prince in the palace speaking with the authority that those surroundings conferred. But the authority collapsed within minutes because what the interview revealed was not just poor judgment, but a quality of character that the public had not previously seen with such devastating clarity, an absolute granite certainty that his version of events should be taken at face value, combined with a total inability to read the room or recognize that his explanations were not merely unconvincing, but extraordinary in their detachment from what the country understood to be normal human behavior and normal human feeling. Maitlis questioned him about his friendship with Epstein, about his visits to Epstein's properties, about whether he had witnessed or been aware of the trafficking of young women, and about the specific allegation made by Virginia Giuffre that she had been trafficked by Epstein and made to have sexual contact with Andrew when she was 17 years old. Andrew denied the allegation. He had consistently denied it. He would continue to deny it. But the manner of his denial on Newsnight became, for the watching public, more damaging than any admission could have been, because it revealed a man who appeared constitutionally incapable of recognizing that his version of events was not merely unconvincing, but extraordinary in its detachment from what the country understood to be normal human behavior. He claimed he had no recollection of meeting Giuffre despite a widely circulated photograph showing them together, Andrew's arm around her waist, Maxwell visible in the background. He offered an explanation for his presence at Epstein's New York residence after Epstein's first conviction, that he had gone to end the friendship in person, and that staying at the house had been convenient. He described a medical condition that he said prevented him from sweating, offered as a rebuttal to Giuffre's account of him sweating on a dance floor. He recalled, in precise and oddly cheerful detail, that on the date Giuffre placed him in London, he had been at a Pizza Express in Woking with Princess Beatrice. He expressed no unprompted empathy for Epstein's victims. He described the friendship with a convicted sex offender as having provided useful networking opportunities. He spoke with the particular baffled courtesy of a man who genuinely could not understand why any of this might be a problem. The interview lasted 49 minutes. By the time it ended, the damage was not merely to Andrew's reputation. It was to the monarchy's ability to maintain even the thinnest fiction that his continued position within the family was tenable. The public response was immediate, overwhelming, and unanimous in a way that British public opinion rarely achieves. Charities and organizations associated with Andrew began to distance themselves within hours of the broadcast. Business partners withdrew. Universities returned donations. The newspapers, across the entire political spectrum, ran their interview at evidence of a man so insulated by privilege, so disconnected from ordinary moral reckoning, that he could not see what every viewer in the country could see plainly, that his explanations were not merely inadequate but bizarre, and that his inability to express basic human sympathy for the victims of a man he had called a friend was disqualifying in a way that no subsequent statement could repair. Social media, which had not existed during Sarah's 1992 humiliation, amplified the damage exponentially. The Pizza Express detail became a meme. The sweating claim became a punchline. Within 48 hours, the Newsnight interview had become the most comprehensively mocked piece of royal communication since the monarchy began engaging with broadcast media. And Buckingham Palace, which had advised against the interview and been overruled by Andrew's private office, found itself managing a crisis that went beyond embarrassment into genuine institutional peril. The monarchy's implicit contract with the British public had always rested on a simple exchange: deference and public funding in return for the maintenance of standards that justified the institution's existence. Andrew's interview threatened that contract because it suggested that the standards applied differently, or did not apply at all, to a prince. If Andrew could not be separated from the family's public image, the family's public image would be contaminated by Andrew. The logic of institutional survival pointed in one direction only. 4 days later, on November 20th, 2019, Andrew issued a statement announcing that he was stepping back from public duties. The statement used the careful, passive language of institutional retreat. He recognized that his association with Epstein had become a major disruption to the royal family's work. He said he had asked the Queen for permission to step back and that she had given it. The language was voluntary. The reality was not. Andrew was not stepping back. He was being removed from the frame by an institution that could no longer afford the cost of keeping him visible. The Queen, who had shielded him for decades, who had tolerated the royal lodge arrangement and the domestic cohabitation and the serial embarrassments, had reached her own limit. Even maternal love, even the indulgence of a favorite son, could not hold against the weight of what the Newsnight interview had revealed. Not a crime, which would have been a legal matter, but something the institution found almost as dangerous: a total absence of the judgment that royal life required. For Sarah, watching from Royal Lodge, the Newsnight interview was the beginning of a collapse she could not stop and had not caused. Her entire domestic position, the house, the daily life, the proximity to the family, depended on Andrew retaining enough residual institutional standing to keep the lease viable and the palace's tolerance intact. Not full restoration, not public prominence, just enough status, enough quiet acceptance, enough of the old deference to justify the arrangement's continuation. The interview destroyed that standing in 49 minutes of broadcast television. From November 2019 onward, every aspect of the York domestic settlement was on borrowed time. The house, the title, the arrangement, all of it now carried the weight of Andrew's disgrace, and the weight was growing with every news cycle. What followed over the next 2 years was the institutional machinery of consequence, applied with the deliberate, incremental precision that the British monarchy brings to the task of dismantling one of its own. The process was not swift. It was not dramatic. It was administrative, procedural, and relentless. Each step removing one more layer of the protections that Andrew had assumed were permanent, each announcement reducing his public identity by one more degree. In August 2021, the civil lawsuit filed by Virginia Giuffre in a New York federal court intensified the pressure to a level the palace could no longer absorb through silence. Giuffre alleged that Andrew had sexually abused her on multiple occasions when she was a minor, having been trafficked to him by Epstein. Andrew denied the allegations. His legal team contested the jurisdiction. The case proceeded through the American courts with the relentless publicity that American litigation generates. Depositions, motions, reporting on every procedural development, and each headline attached Andrew's name more firmly to the Epstein scandal in the public mind. The palace could not wish the case away. It could not manage it through briefings. It could not deploy the usual tools of institutional communication because the case was unfolding in a foreign legal system where the monarchy's informal influence did not reach. And the longer it continued, the more impossible it became for the institution to maintain any version of the argument that Andrew's remaining status was sustainable. On January 13th, 2022, Buckingham Palace acted. The announcement was devastating in its brevity. Prince Andrew's military affiliations and royal patronages were returned to the Queen. The Duke of York would continue not to undertake any public duties and was defending the civil case as a private citizen. The statement was 2 sentences long. It ended a lifetime. The military affiliations mattered more than the patronages because they were the last public expression of the identity Andrew had built since the Falklands. Colonel of the Grenadier Guards, honorary Air Commodore of RAF Lossiemouth. The titles and honorary ranks that connected the prince to the armed forces and through them to the version of himself that he had carried for 40 years, the man of action, the war veteran, the prince who had earned his place through service as well as birth. Stripping them did not merely reduce his public role. It dismantled the last credible narrative he possessed about who he was. The man who had flown Sea King helicopters in the South Atlantic, who had come home from the Falklands with the self-image of a warrior prince, was now a private citizen whose only remaining public identity was as a defendant in an American civil case. The transformation was complete, and it had been administered not by a tabloid or a court, but by his own family, in the name of his own mother. The civil case was settled in February 2022. Andrew made a substantial financial payment. The exact figure was not publicly confirmed, but reporting placed it in the region of £12 million, and issued a statement acknowledging that Epstein's victims had suffered and that he regretted his association with Epstein. He did not admit liability. He did not apologize to Giuffre specifically. The settlement ended the legal threat, but not the reputational catastrophe, because the payment itself became conclusive evidence in the court of public opinion. The man who had denied everything on national television, who had insisted he had no recollection of meeting his accuser, who had invoked Pizza Express and a medical inability to sweat, had paid a sum that ordinary people could not imagine to make the case go away. The public drew its conclusions. The settlement bought legal silence. It did not buy public belief, and it did not protect the Royal Lodge arrangement because the settlement's existence became, in itself, another reason the arrangement was unsustainable. Around the York domestic arrangement, the atmosphere changed in ways that were both gradual and irreversible. The Royal Lodge lease, which had once been treated by the press as a footnote, an oddity of Crown estate management that occasionally surfaced in property supplements or Royal Watcher columns, became a focal point of public anger about privilege in a way that transformed the house from a private residence into a political problem. Journalists returned to the details with new urgency. The peppercorn rent on a property valued at £30 million, the 75-year term that would not expire until 2078, the £1 million one-off payment that bore no relationship to the property's market value, and above all the fact that a man who had been stripped of his public duties, who had settled a civil case brought by a woman alleging sexual abuse, who had been separated from his military affiliations and royal patronages and reduced to the status of a private citizen, was still occupying a 30-room house in Windsor Great Park at a cost that ordinary taxpayers would find incomprehensible. The lease became a symbol, not merely of Andrew's personal entitlement, but of the monarchy's inability or unwillingness to apply to its own members the standards of accountability it expected of everyone else. The press reporting on the lease intensified through 2023 and 2024, each article adding another layer of public pressure. There were questions about compensation, whether Andrew would be entitled to a payment if the lease were terminated before its expiry, given the millions he had invested in refurbishment. There were questions about the Crown Estate's governance and whether the original terms had been appropriate. There were questions about alternative accommodation, where Andrew would go, who would pay for it, and whether any subsequent arrangement would simply replicate the problem in a different postcode. The house that had been Sarah's fortress and the York's domestic stronghold was becoming, in the language of political crisis management, untenable. It could not be defended. It could not be justified. And with every month that Andrew remained inside it, the cost to the monarchy's public standing grew. Sarah's own position worsened during this period, not because she was the principal offender in this phase of the story, but because she was attached, by domestic proximity and emotional history, to the same network of contamination that was closing around Andrew. In 2025, the Associated Press reported on an email in which Sarah had apparently described Jeffrey Epstein as a supreme friend, though the agency noted it had been unable to independently verify the message's authenticity. The detail was damaging regardless of verification, because it connected Sarah's name to the Epstein scandal in a way that went beyond mere cohabitation with Andrew. Charities that had maintained their association with her, organizations that had valued her warmth, her public profile, her genuine capacity for engagement with causes she cared about, began to distance themselves. Patron lists were quietly revised, invitations were reconsidered. Her public profile, already diminished by decades of scandal and narrowed by the recent crises surrounding Andrew, contracted further. She was being eroded not by her own actions in this phase, but by proximity, by the fact that she lived in the house, shared the arrangement, and could not be separated, in the public imagination or in the institutional calculation, from the man whose disgrace, had made the house indefensible. And then there was her body. In June 2023, Sarah was diagnosed with breast cancer. She underwent a mastectomy and began the process of treatment and reconstruction that cancer imposes. The hospital visits, the consultations, the physical recovery that takes months and changes the relationship between a person and the body they inhabit. The diagnosis was made public, and for a brief period, the coverage shifted register. The tabloids, which had spent 3 decades treating Sarah as a figure of mockery, acknowledged the gravity of what she was facing. There was sympathy. There was restraint. The unspoken understanding was that serious illness temporarily suspended the usual rules of engagement. That even Fergie was allowed to be a cancer patient without qualification. Then in January 2024 came a second diagnosis, malignant melanoma, discovered during the reconstructive surgery that had followed the mastectomy. 2 cancers in 7 months. Sarah was 64 years old. She was living in a house that the institution was preparing to take from her. She was attached to a man whose public life had been destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. She was carrying a name that functioned in the national conversation primarily as a punchline. And she was now fighting for her physical survival while the domestic, institutional, and reputational ground beneath her continued to give way. The accumulation of pressures, medical, financial, institutional, and personal, had the quality of a siege conducted not by a single army but by converging forces that were not coordinating, but were all arriving at the same point. The end of the York arrangement, the end of the Royal Lodge years, the end of the structure that had sustained Sarah Ferguson's improbable post-divorce existence for nearly 2 decades. The central tragedy, when it arrived, was not a death. It was not a fire or a flight or a body found. It was an administrative act performed in the cold language of palace communication that ended the York domestic settlement with the finality of a document signed and a key surrendered. And yet its weight was devastating because what it destroyed was not merely a housing arrangement, but the last physical proof that Sarah Ferguson's 30-year refusal to vanish had achieved something durable. On October 30th, 2025, Buckingham Palace issued a statement. The statement said that Prince Andrew would henceforth be known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. It said that formal notice had been served requiring the surrender of the Royal Lodge lease. It said that Andrew would move to alternative private accommodation. The language was precise, procedural, and comprehensive in a way that left no ambiguity. Every element of the old York arrangement was addressed in a single announcement. The use of the ducal title, which had been Andrew's since his wedding day in 1986. The house, which had been his since 2003 and Sarah's in practice since 2008. And the future, which would be determined not by Andrew's preferences, but by the institution's decision. What had taken decades to build, the domestic fortress, the tolerated cohabitation, the unspoken understanding that the Yorks would be accommodated as long as they did not force the institution's hand to stay signal, was dismantled in the space of a press release. The statement was dated, it was official, it was issued under the authority of the king, and it was final. The renaming was, in some ways, the most symbolically violent element. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. The name stripped of its royal architecture. No Duke of York, no Prince Andrew, no HRH, none of the layered titulature that the British monarchy uses to locate individuals within its hierarchy of deference and obligation. The name that remained was a legal name, a passport name, the name of a private citizen who happened to have been born into the royal family. It was the monarchy's way of saying, you are no longer ours. You are no longer part of the structure. You are a person with a surname, and the surname is all you have. Sarah Ferguson was not named in the statement. That absence was, in its way, the detail that carried the most weight. The woman who had spent more than 30 years refusing to vanish from the House of Windsor, who had outlasted Philip's contempt, the tabloid campaigns, the financial crises, the serial humiliations, the health scares, and the slow administrative erosion of every position she had fought to maintain, was not mentioned in the document that ended the arrangement her persistence had created. She was inside the meaning of the statement. Everyone who read it understood that the surrender of the Royal Lodge lease meant Sarah's displacement as much as Andrew's. That the house she had called home, the domestic space around which she had organized her post-divorce existence, was being taken not just from Andrew, but from her. But she was not inside the language. The palace addressed Andrew. It addressed the lease. It addressed the accommodation. It did not address the woman who had lived in the house for 17 years, who had raised her daughters there, who had described herself as a guest with such frequency that the word had become a private form of irony. The statement treated her as though she were not a party to the arrangement. And in the constitutional grammar of the monarchy, she wasn't. She was not royal. She was not the leaseholder. She was not, in any formal sense, that the institution recognized a person whose displacement required acknowledgement. She was someone who had been there and who would now have to be somewhere else. The statement was issued under the authority of King Charles III. Charles had inherited the throne on September 8, 2022, following the Queen's death at Balmoral at the age of 96. The end of a 70-year reign and the removal of the last figure whose authority and maternal attachment had shielded the York arrangement from institutional correction. The Queen's death changed the calculus entirely. She had been the reason the arrangement endured, not because she approved of it, but because she was unwilling to dismantle it. And nobody else had the authority to override her unwillingness. Charles did. He had spent the subsequent years pursuing the institutional reform that the press described as slimming down the monarchy, reducing the number of working royals, tightening the relationship between public expenditure and public duty, ending the ambiguity about who was a working member of the family and who was not, and addressing the legacy problems that his mother's decades of non-confrontational management had left unresolved and festering. The York situation was the largest and most publicly visible of those legacies. A disgraced brother occupying a crown-linked property on terms that the public found indefensible, accompanied by an ex-wife whose presence the institution had never endorsed, sustained by a lease whose generous terms had become a source of genuine public anger about royal privilege. Charles had, by reporting that accumulated through 2024 and 2025, been urging Andrew to leave Royal Lodge voluntarily for months. He had reportedly offered alternative accommodation. He had, through intermediaries, made clear that the old arrangement could not survive his reign. Andrew had resisted. He had explored legal options to challenge the lease surrender. He had behaved in the manner that had defined his entire adult life, as though the arrangements made for him would hold because they had always held before. They did not hold. Charles was not the Queen. He did not manage the family through avoidance, through maternal patience, through the hope that time and silence would wear down problems that confrontation might inflame. He managed through decision. And the decision, when it came, carried the weight of a king who had waited decades for the authority to act on what he had long believed was necessary, and who was now exercising that authority with a completeness that left nothing to renegotiate, nothing to appeal, and nothing to hold on to. The days and weeks following the statement were defined by the logistics of dispersal, the unglamorous, physically exhausting process of emptying a house that had been occupied for more than 20 years. Royal Lodge, the 30-room residence in 98 acres of Windsor Great Park, the house where the Queen Mother had spent her last decades, where Andrew had invested millions in refurbishment, where Sarah had built the domestic foundation of her post-divorce survival, where Beatrice and Eugenie had grown from teenagers into mothers, was being vacated. The process was not public. No cameras recorded the removal of furniture and personal effects, the closing of rooms that had been lived in and argued in and eaten in and decorated for Christmas for 2 decades, the packing of photographs and children's drawings, and the accumulated domestic archaeology of a family that had functioned, however imperfectly, as a unit. But the fact of it was reported, and the reporting carried the unmistakable weight of an ending that was not merely administrative but existential. The Yorks were leaving the house that had defined them. And the house, once they were gone, would revert to the Crown estate, would become again simply a property, stripped of the private meaning that 2 decades of occupation had given it. By January 2026, press reports described Sarah Ferguson as being without a settled home of her own. The woman who had spent 17 years at Royal Lodge, who had converted her presence in the house into the physical foundation of her entire post-divorce existence, who had described herself as a guest with such practiced regularity that the formula had become its own form of dark comedy, was now, at the age of 66, facing the question of where to live, with a rawness that recalled the early post-divorce years of financial precariousness and institutional rejection. She had her daughters, she had her grandchildren, she had her health, uncertain as it was after 2 cancer diagnoses in 7 months. She had the title she had carried since 1986, Duchess of York, though the name now attached to a woman with no house, no HRH, no institutional role, and no formal claim on the family whose name she bore. The ground she had fought to hold, year after year, scandal after scandal, decade after decade, had been pulled away, not by tabloid exposure, not by the public mockery. She had survived so many times, not by Philip's contempt or the debt or the cash for access sting, but by an administrative decision issued in the measured language of a Buckingham Palace press release. The end, when it came, was not dramatic. It was procedural, and that was what made it so complete. Andrew's fate was reported with greater specificity. By February 2026, multiple outlets described him as having left Royal Lodge permanently and as now residing on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, the late Queen's country property. A royal residence, but not the one he had chosen, not the one he had refurbished at a cost of millions, not the house that had carried the weight of his mother's memory and his own long refusal to accept diminished status. The move to Norfolk was not exile in the formal sense. It was accommodation, private, rural, distant from London and Windsor and the social world that had once revolved around a prince. But it carried the unmistakable quality of a man who had been placed where he could do the least damage and attract the least attention, housed in a property that was not his property, in a county that was not his county, at a remove from the centers of power and visibility that made continued relevance impossible. The indulged younger son, who had mistaken protection for permanence, had discovered at last that the protection was conditional and the permanence was borrowed. The house is lost, the name is altered. The old York world, the world of Royal Lodge, of the tolerated arrangement, of the domestic fortress built on a lease and sustained by maternal persistence and institutional avoidance, is over. But the human consequences of those decades remain unsettled, and they extend far beyond the two people whose names dominated the headlines. What did 30 years of tolerated unreality do to the woman who lived inside it, who built her survival on a foundation that was never legally hers? What did it cost the daughters who grew up managing their parents' disgrace while trying to build lives of their own? What does the public memory of Fergie, the tabloid caricature, the toe-sucking punchline, the commercial hustle, owe to the actual woman behind the image? And what does it reveal about the monarchy itself, that its final solution to the York problem was not confrontation, not reform, not even punishment in any recognizable dramatic sense, but a late, quiet, administrative tidying up of lives that had already been worn down to the point where resistance was no longer possible? The collapse of the York arrangement did not produce a single clean ending. It produced several endings, arriving in sequence over the course of 6 years, each one stripping away another layer of the life that Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew had built inside the walls of Royal Lodge. The slow motion quality of the destruction was itself part of its cruelty, because at each stage the people inside the arrangement were given time to hope that the process might stop, that the institution might settle for a partial correction, that the remaining protection might hold, before the next removal demonstrated that the process had a logic of its own and would not be interrupted. Andrew's trajectory was the starkest because it traced the most complete arc of diminishment that any modern member of the royal family has undergone. First, the public duties, voluntarily surrendered in November 2019 in the aftermath of the Newsnight catastrophe, though voluntarily was the word the statement used, not the word the situation warranted. Then the military affiliations and royal patronages, returned to the Queen in January 2022 in a 2-sentence announcement that ended the last public expression of the identity Andrew had carried since the Falklands. Then the settlement of the civil case with its reported £12 million and its carefully worded acknowledgement that Epstein's victims had suffered, an acknowledgement that stopped short of apology and short of admission, but that functioned in the public mind as both. Then the October 2025 statement, the formal end of the ducal title usage, the surrender notice on the Royal Lodge lease, the instruction to move to alternative accommodation, And finally, by February 2026, the physical relocation itself, no longer at Royal Lodge, no longer in Windsor, but at the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, housed in accommodation that belonged to the Crown and not to him, in a county whose rural quietness placed him at a deliberate geographical and social distance from London, from the court, and from the centers of visibility that his former life had required. The stripping was not one event, it was a sequence: duty, title, house, location, and each removal revealed how much of the previous layer had depended on the one beneath it. Without the duty, the titles became indefensible. Without the titles, the house became a scandal. Without the house, the man became invisible. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, as he was now formally known, had been reduced to a private citizen in a borrowed house in the Norfolk countryside, and the self-image that had sustained him since the Falklands, the prince, the man of action, the duke, the occupant of the Queen Mother's house, had been dismantled so thoroughly that what remained was a man without a public role, a public identity, or a plausible narrative about what his life was for. The trajectory was remarkable not for its drama, but for its completeness. Each layer of protection had been removed in order, and each removal had revealed how little lay beneath. The confidence that had carried him through the Newsnight interview, the confidence that had made him believe he could explain the inexplicable and be believed, turned out not to be strength at all. It was the absence of self-knowledge, the blind certainty of a man who had never been required to see himself as others saw him, and who discovered too late that the world he had been raised to inhabit no longer existed. Sarah's aftermath was different in character, but no less devastating in its implications. She had survived. That had always been her defining quality: the refusal to disappear, the persistence that had outlasted Philip's contempt and the tabloid campaigns and the financial crises and the institutional attempts at erasure. But survival after the loss of Royal Lodge looked different from survival inside it. The house had given her ground, physical, domestic, psychological ground. It had given her a place where she was not performing, not selling, not managing the gap between what she appeared to possess and what she actually held. Without it, she was once again the woman she had been in the late 1990s, a duchess without a residence, a mother without institutional backing, a public figure whose name was more famous than her circumstances warranted. She continued to appear publicly after her cancer treatment, but the appearances had a different quality now. Less the return of a figure rehabilitated by endurance, more the visibility of a woman who had nowhere else to go but forward. She continued her charitable associations where they survived. She continued to write and to speak and to work the commercial circus that had sustained her through decades of financial precariousness. But the base was gone. The social position was narrower. The patronage list was shorter, trimmed by the charities that had distanced themselves after the Epstein-related reporting. And the domestic arrangement that had given her life its organizing structure, the house, the proximity, the fiction of guesthood that everyone understood was not fiction at all, had been ended by a statement that did not even acknowledge her existence. The woman who had spent decades converting maternal indispensability into a form of domestic permanence had discovered what the institution had always known and she had always refused to accept: that the permanence was never hers to claim. It had always belonged to the lease, and the lease had always belonged to the crown. For Beatrice and Eugenie, the aftermath was about the particular burden of being the next generation in a story that refused to end. Their titles had not been touched by the 2025 announcement. The palace statement addressed Andrew's status, not his daughter's. And in that distinction lay the monarchy's usual strategy for managing contaminated branches: isolate the source of the damage, preserve the children, keep the grandchildren moving forward into lives that are less marked by the scandal than their parents were. It was a strategy that had been applied in different forms to other difficult royal situations across the decades, and it reflected a pragmatic institutional wisdom about the limits of punishment. Beatrice and Eugenie had not caused the York crisis. They had been born into it, grown up inside it, and spent their entire adult lives managing its consequences while trying to build something of their own. Punishing them for their father's disgrace would have served no institutional purpose and would have generated the kind of public sympathy for wronged princesses, for blameless daughters, that the palace preferred to avoid. But the absence of formal punishment did not mean the absence of consequence. The consequences were subtler, more pervasive, and more permanent than any title change could have imposed. Beatrice, who had spent her entire adult life trying to build a private identity independent of the York dysfunction, now carried a family name that had been publicly degraded in a way that no amount of personal good conduct could reverse. Every introduction, every social encounter, every professional meeting carried the invisible weight of the York Association. Not the York of 1986, the handsome prince and his laughing bride, but the York of 2019 and 2022 and 2025, the York of Newsnight and the settlement and the surrendered lease. That weight was not a punishment she had earned. It was an inheritance she had received, not money, not title, in any functionally useful sense, but the lifelong labor of carrying a surname after the structure that had given it meaning had collapsed beneath it. Eugenie's position was marginally warmer, in that her public profile had always been more openly maintained and her relationship with both parents more visibly affectionate. She continued her work in the art world. She continued to appear at public events with Jack Brooks Bank with the easy warmth that had always characterized her public manner. She continued to build a family. August in 2021, Ernest in 2023, a third child expected in 2026. The York branch was not extinct. It was dispersed, diminished, morally reduced in the public estimation, but it was producing children, which meant it was producing a future. What that future's relationship with the monarchy would look like, whether the grandchildren of Andrew and Sarah would grow up carrying the weight of the York name or would be permitted by time and institutional pragmatism to outgrow it, was a question that could not yet be answered. What could be said was that the pattern the outline had traced across 3 generations. The monarchy managing pain spatially, men of rank protected long, past the point of ordinary consequence, women punished for making visible what the institution wanted hidden, and children inheriting the damage of action had not stopped. It had merely moved forward into smaller bodies and newer names. The cultural afterlife of the York story was already substantial by the time the Royal Lodge arrangement ended, and it revealed something important about how the public consumed the family's disintegration and what the consumption missed. Sarah's humiliation had been the first to enter the machinery of popular dramatization. The tabloid photographs of 1992 were recycled endlessly for 3 decades, resurfacing whenever a New York scandal required historical context, or whenever an editor needed a reliable image of royal disgrace. The Crown, Netflix's prestige dramatization of the royal family, depicted the toe-sucking scandal in its 5th season, broadcast in 2022. The series showed the photograph's aftermath from the inside: Sarah's vulnerability, the cruelty of the Balmoral breakfasts, the speed with which a private body became public property. And for some viewers, it produced a sympathy that the original coverage had not generated. Emma Laird Forbes played Sarah with an emotional openness that allowed the character something the tabloids had never permitted the real woman: the dignity of being understood. But the dramatization also reinforced the compression that had defined Sarah's public identity for 30 years. She was still, even in a prestige production, primarily the woman in the photographs. The decades of persistence, the domestic strategy, the conversion of maternal indispensability into survival, the deeper and more interesting stories remained outside the frame. Andrew's side of the saga generated a newer and more concentrated screen afterlife. In 2024, 2 productions arrived in the same year, both focused on the Newsnight interview and its consequences. Scoop, a Netflix film, told the story from the perspective of the BBC producers who secured the interview, a production narrative that emphasized the journalistic achievement while keeping Andrew's interiority at a distance. A Very Royal Scandal, an Amazon series, went closer, with Michael Sheen delivering a performance of Andrew that captured something essential about the man: the unshakable confidence, the inability to read the room, the particular quality of entitlement that believes explanation is the same as exoneration. Both productions were effective within their chosen frames. Neither addressed the longer domestic story: the house, the cohabitation, the daughters growing up inside the arrangement, the Queen's silent tolerance, and Charles's eventual enforcement. The York story had been dramatized as a collection of incidents, the photographs, the interview, the scandal, rather than as the multi decade dynastic decline that it actually was. Andrew Loney's biography, entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York, published in 2022, came closer to the full picture. It framed the story not as a series of isolated disgraces, but as the trajectory of a family branch that had been structurally unsustainable from the beginning, too dependent on institutional tolerance, too financially precarious, too emotionally exposed, and too poorly equipped for the scrutiny that proximity to the crown guaranteed. The book could not capture the final act because the final act had not yet occurred when it was published. But its framework was the right one: decline, not scandal; erosion, not explosion; the slow, grinding consequence of a branch that had been sustained by the wrong things, proximity rather than purpose, accommodation rather than reform, a house rather than the future. What remains in the present day is highly specific and resists any attempt at a tidy summary. Royal Lodge is no longer the York stronghold, the house that the Queen Mother occupied for 50 years, that Andrew refurbished at a cost of millions, that Sarah made her home for nearly 2 decades, has been emptied of the family that gave it its most recent and most controversial chapter. The property reverts to the Crown Estate. Its future use has not been publicly determined. The rooms where the pre-wedding dinner for Eugenie's marriage was held, where the York family celebrated Christmases, where Sarah organized the domestic life that constituted her long post-divorce survival, stand empty. The house indoors, the family that filled it does not. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor is 66 years old. He lives on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, in private accommodation that belongs to the Crown and not to him. He has no public role, no military affiliations, no royal patronages, and no plausible route to their restoration. He is, in every functional sense, a retired private citizen whose only remaining public identity is defined by the things that were taken from him and the interview that precipitated their removal. Sarah Ferguson is 66 years old. She remains Duchess of York, a title she has carried since her wedding day in 1986. But the title attaches to a woman without a fixed home of her own, without an HRH, without an institutional role, and without the domestic base that sustained her for 17 years. She has survived 2 cancers. She has survived 30 years of public mockery. She has survived the loss of Royal Lodge. She has not survived into comfort or security or the kind of late life settlement that might have rewarded her persistence. Whether survival itself constitutes a kind of achievement or whether it is merely a description of what happens when a person refuses to stop is a question the story leaves unanswered. Princess Beatrice is 37. She is married to Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi. She has 2 daughters, Sienna and Athena. She lives quietly, deliberately, and with a privacy that is both chosen and earned. Princess Eugenie is 36. She is married to Jack Brooksbank. She has 2 sons, August and Ernest, and is expecting a 3rd child. She works, she appears publicly, and she maintains the relationship with the institution that her parents could not sustain. Philip is dead. The Queen is dead. The Queen Mother is dead. Diana is dead. The generation that built the framework within which the York story unfolded. The generation that set the codes managed by avoidance and believed that the institution's survival depended on the suppression of visible mess is gone. What remains is a newer, smaller monarchy under a king who has chosen enforcement over accommodation, and a dispersed York family whose members are scattered across Norfolk, London, and the home counties connected by blood and shared experience, and a knowledge of public damage that no amount of time will erase entirely. There is no neat moral to this story. Sarah Ferguson did not overthrow the monarchy, and the monarchy did not entirely succeed in erasing her. What the York story reveals is something messier and more characteristically British than either of those endings: that houses can become substitutes for love, that status can postpone consequences without canceling them, and that what children inherit from a damaged dynasty is not security, but the lifelong labor of carrying a family name after the structure beneath it has given way. The public saw the joke, the photographs, the red hair, the toe sucking, the cash in the hotel room. The real story was a woman who refused to vanish, and a family system so dependent on avoidance that it took more than 30 years to decide what to do with her. She was never fully restored. She was never fully forgiven. And in the end, she was not even named in the statement that ended the arrangement. The house disappeared from under her in the passive language of palace administration. That is how royal punishment often works, not through dramatic banishment, but through a late administrative tidying up of lives that have already been worn down, to the point where the tidying barely makes a sound.